So, last year, please go check out last year's videos. I'll try and remember to put the links up in the description box here. I did books that made me go, "Ugh," and then I did cozy mysteries for Halloween. So this year I thought I would do some actual ghost stories. I got out my little display here. Um so I thought we'd stick with it. Welcome to the D. Louise book series. I'm Christina Tina. This is where I read books, talk about books, no special effects, no theme music, none of that fancy stuff going on here. So please definitely go check out the cozy mysteries from last year and the books that make me because there was some of them. That one with the headlights was just but anyways, this year I thought we'd do some ghost stories, and I've got a few here um to look at with you. Uh, so here, so we'll go through those in a minute. There's more in the pile, but I just thought we'd read some of these stories. And The Legend of Lady Skipwith. What? Do you want to come up? You want to come join story time? Come here. You want to come here? Come on. Come on. Oops. Here. Oh, card came in here. Okay. So. Oh, wait. Let's do this one first. The Curse Tree of Jamestown Island. It would be highly unlikely that you would find the story in any of the countless history books which chronicle the life and times of the settlers at Jamestown and the colonialists at Williamsburg. Nor would you be apt to hear tour guides rate this strange tale if you visit the major attractions at Jamestown Festival or Colonial Williamsburg. Rather, you must travel somewhat off the beaten track to Jamestown Island itself, about a mile or two away from the park. The area today is maintained jointly by the Association for Preservation of Virginia Antiquities and the National Park Service. Just beyond Jamestown Memorial Church, which was built in 1907 upon the foundation of an original church erected in 1617, lies a small, quiet, tree-shaded cemetery containing only a handful of graves. It is here that James and Sarah Harrison Blair are buried. Chances are, unless you are more than a casual buff of colonial history, the name of James Blair is unfamiliar. This is an unfortunate injustice to the man, for he was an important figure in Virginia's history during the latter days of the 17th century and well into the 18th century. Born in Scotland and educated at the University of Edinburgh, he filled, according to the markings on his tombstone, the offices of preacher of the gospel for 54 years. He also served as faithful counselor to the British governor and subsequently as governor of the colony. Further, he has been described by biographers as a very powerful man and the chief force behind the founding of the College of William and Mary, the second oldest institution of higher learning in the country. On a more personal note, his tombstone points out the comeliness of a handsome face adored. He entertained elegantly in a cheerful, hospitable manner, without luxury, ineffability he excelled. It was in the year 1687, Sarah Harrison, by popular accounts, was then a striking, beautiful young lady of 17, who, because of the relative comfortable financial position of her parents, was an active participant in the plantation circle's social life along the lower James River. The oldest daughter of the mighty colonial Benjamin Harris of Wakefield Plantation, a wealthy landowner, she had been described as vivacious, full of life, and headstrong. Some intimate that she was a forerunner to the late 20th century women's liberation movement, because it is alleged she spoke her piece whenever she felt slighted by the young men of the day. Despite this strongly independent nature, or perhaps because of it, in conjunction with her natural beauty, Sarah Harrison was effectively wooed by a number of handsome and eligible suitors. In 1687, according to Sam Robinson, a longtime caretaker at Jamestown Island, the first signed marriage contract with a young gentleman by the name of William Roscoe. He was 22 and she was 17. The contract stated that she should never marry to any man on earth other than Roscoe as long as he lived. So keep her God, signed Sarah Harrison. However, 3 weeks later, she met the handsome, charismatic Blair. She was swept off her feet. Her parents were not so enchanted. There were 2 immediate problems. She was already engaged to a perfectly acceptable man, according to them. Secondly, James Blair at the time was 31 years old, twice Sarah's age. As Robinson Cully phrased it, in olden day, young girl was to marry elder gentleman was called a disgrace to her parents. Cause nowadays it doesn't make any difference just as long as he has money. What immediately ensued was the expected a bitter rift between daughter and parents. This intensified when Sarah broke her initial engagement and told them she planned to marry Reverend Blair. Through reasoning, arguments, and threats, her parents tried everything to discourage the union, but Sarah's mind was made up. As Robinson recounted, she broke the contract. Then her lover William Roscoe, causing his death, made her heartbreak, and married Blair. It is not known if her parents intended the affair. One version, though, has it that Sarah refused to utter the words to obey at the ceremony. As it was said, she was a mind of her own, this girl. Her parents would not give up even after the wedding. They sought to have the marriage annulled. But here fate took a curious hand. In Robinson's words, Colonial Benjamin, Mrs. Hannah, his wife, and his baby daughter, all 3 of them were killed on Route 5 at Berkeley by lightning, so they did not get a chance in life to separate Miss Sarah from Dr. Blair. Sarah and James Blair, it is said, lived a happy life together as man and wife. She died in 1713 at the age of 42, still unforgiven by her family. By disobeying her parents in life and to marry Dr. Blair, her family consent, the Harrison family buried away from her family. On her tombstone are Latin words which translated say, "In sacred memory here lies, in hope of blessed resurrection, the body of Mrs. Sarah Blair, exceedingly beloved and lamented." Her husband lived on for 30 years, contributing significantly to the continued growth and prosperity of the young colony. When he died in 1743, he was laid to rest at a site 6 inches beyond, on the left side of his wife's grave. In the year 1750, 7 years after Blair's death, fate intervened again. Robinson told what happened this way. Was stoned in fence around the 2 graves 6 inches apart, side by side. A sycamore tree came between them. A little sapling. Wasn't anything done to prevent the tree from growing, and as it grew, it caught in the center tomb by Dr. Blair, broke the stones then in 2 ends, right where her stone was joined to Dr. Blair's stone, pushed her tomb up out of the ground, and pushed back on the head 7 feet from her husband over to the right 6 inches. And so the legend went. Sarah's parents, who could not dissolve her marriage with Blair while they were alive, finally were able to separate the lover after death. Believe it or not, Collins calling the sycamore tree the mother-in-law tree. Others have referred to it as the cursed tree. Robinson, who told the story many times, once to Queen Elizabeth of England during her visit to Jamestown in 1957, upon the 350th anniversary of the first settlers' landing. The mother-in-law didn't get a chance in life to separate her daughter from Dr. Blair, but she did come back and plant the old sycamore to separate her. The ethereal appearance of Evelyn Boyd. 2 metallic eagles adorn the gate post leading into Westover Plantation in Charles City County, Virginia, set majestically along a beautiful stretch of James River, not as well known as the neighboring Berkeley Plantation, Westover. Nevertheless, it is considered an outstanding example of Georgian architecture in America. The mansion features a steeply sloping roof flanked by tall chimneys in pairs at both ends. Westover was the scene of lavish social entertainment among the more affluent colonists during the 18th century. Great parties were held there with rich and famous as frequent guests, but the house is also filled with history of sadness and tragedy. It was there such a thing as a benevolent spirit, or at least one who was dedicated not to frighten those who see it, then there is perhaps no better example than the gentle, most fragile spirit of Evelyn Bird of Westover. Though she had been dead for nearly 250 years, her apparition still occasionally appears there, a wreath-like figure, most dressed in white, sad and haunting, as if still seeking the happiness which eluded her in life. Born in 1707, she was a bright child, a bit spoiled, precocious, and high-spirited. She was the daughter of William Byrd II, Master of Westover and one of the most prominent statesmen of his time, Secretary of the Virginia colony, for years advisor to the governor, founder of the city of Richmond, wealthy landowner and country squire. When she was just 10, her father took her to England so she could be properly schooled. There she flowered into a beautiful young woman with porcelain-like skin, shining chestnut hair, oriental blue eyes, and Mona Lisa-like smile. It was that when she presented at court at age 16, the King of England remarked, "I'm not surprised why our young men are going to Virginia if there are so many pretty birds there." It was in London that Evelyn fell deeply in love with a handsome Englishman. Most historians believe he was Charles Mordaunt, the grandson of Lord Peterborough. Her father violently objected to the romance, telling her that if she proceeded with it, as to any expectation you may fondly entertain of a fortune from me, you are not to look for one brass farthing. Nay, besides all that, I will avoid the sight of you of a detested creature. And so, against the desires of her heart, Evelyn Boyd returned to Westover in 1726 a different woman. The spark of her personality was diminished, and spent long hours by herself, withdrawn, almost reclusive. A number of potential suitors from nearby plantations paid her visits over the next few years, but she spurned them all. He referred to her as the antique virgin. She confided only in her close friend Anne Carter Harrison of Berkeley Plantation. They would, yes, ma'am. I had you up here. You're the one that left. Anne Carter Harrison of nearby Berkeley Plantation. They would walk in the formal gardens and talk among the giant woods, passing the afternoons away. It was amid a popular grove one day that the two young ladies made a pact. Whichever one died first would try to return to visit in such fashion as not to frighten anyone. Did Evelyn have a premonition, for soon after she passed away, some say of a broken heart. On her tombstone was inscribed the following: "Here in the sleep of repose the body of Evelyn Bird, daughter of Honorable William Bird," and the various excellent endowments of nature, improved and imperfect by an accomplished education, formed her. So here she lies in her grave, to which God was pleased to call this lady on the 13th day of November, 1737, at the age of 29. For months, the saddened Anne Harris did not venture along the trails and trees they had walked so often, but one day she finally did go to the popular grove and felt a presence. She turned and saw Evelyn dressed in white, dazzling in ethereal loveliness. She drifted forward a few steps, kissed her hand to the beholder, smiled, and vanished. In the intervening generations, many of others have caught fleeting glimpses of Evelyn among the former Westover owners. In 1856, for example, one woman told John Selden, who lived at Westover, that she was awakened in the night and found a young lady standing in the room, who quickly went out the door. The woman described the lady and her dress. Oh, yes, that was Evelyn Bird. In 1920s, a young girl sleeping in the same third-floor bedroom proclaimed an identical experience. In the early 1900s, a workman was dispatched to do some repair work in the bedroom. Minutes later, he came running down the stairs to the owner. "You didn't tell me there was a young lady up there." He'd seen her combing her hair before a mirror, but when they went back upstairs, there was no one there. In December 1929, a guest of Richard Crane, who then owned the plantation, reported seeing the filmy, nebulous, cloudy figure of a woman, so transparent no features could be distinguished, only the gazy texture of a woman's form. In fact, when the Cranes bought Westover around 1920, Mrs. Crane said, Oh dear, we'll never get any help because of the ghost. But they had no trouble because even though the legend of Evelyn's reappearance was known throughout Charles City County, servants also believed her to be a friendly spirit. And indeed, servants too have experienced the phenomenon. One old butler was coming down a narrow passageway in the hall when he saw a lady. Presuming it to be Mrs. Crane, he stepped aside to let her pass. She disappeared before her eyes. Another time, a cook saw the apparition of a woman without her head, her view partially blocked by the pantry shelves. More recently, Mr. Bagley, who lives in a small house between the mansion and the cemetery where Evelyn is buried, was in the kitchen one evening when he saw a young woman eye level outside on the lawn. Thinking it was Mrs. Bruce, the then mistress of Leftover, he went outside to say hello, but when he got out there was no one there. Let's see. The Shirley Plantation, located at overlooking Seine in the James River about halfway between Williamsburg and Richmond. It was originally owned by Sir Thomas West, the first royal governor of the colonial Virginia. He named it in honor of his wife's father, Sir Thomas Shirley of Whitsun, England. Later, the plantation gained eminence at the home of Colonial Edward Hill, who held many high offices in the colony, though the mid-17th century, including Speaker of the Assembly of Burgess and Treasurer of Virginia. The estate has been in the Hill and Carter family for 300 years. The present house was begun in 1723 by Edward Hill. Also a man of status in the colony, he built it for his daughter Elizabeth, who married John Carter, son of the legendary King Carter. It took nearly 50 years to complete the construction and was done, as one author described it, with a lavish disregard for cost, seldom in the building of great mansions. Shirley was a well-known center of hospitality 100 years before and during the American Revolution. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were guests there, as many numerous prominent Virginians. There are also many interesting anecdotes and stories about events which have transpired at Shirley. One of the more charming concerns the time a young and beautiful Anne Hill Carter was carrying a punch bowl across the dining room when it began to slip from her fingers. She was rescued by a dashing young military officer, Light Horse Harry Lee. Not long afterwards, they married at Shirley. Their son became one of the most famous of all Virginians and Americans. He was Robert E. Lee. This is fascinating to this day, the inexplicable story of Anne Pratt, or more specifically of her famous portrait. She was reportedly a sister of Edward Hill and was born late in the 17th century. Little is known of her, but it is said that there was always a certain air of mystery about the woman. Whatever one of the things for which Shirley is noted for is a fine collection of family portraits. Apparently, Aunt Pruitt's portrait occupied a suitable space in a downstairs room for a number of years after her death. Then, as a new generation of family took over, occupancy decided to redecorate, and the portrait was taken down and banished to the attic. Anne Pratt, or if you will, her spirit, did not take kindly to this. In fact, she made what family members describe as a mighty disturbance. This usually took the form of a sound of a woman rocking in the attic late at night. A number of guests, as well as Hills and Carters, told of hearing the incessant rocking on a certain night. When they assumed this summoned courage to check the attic, all was still and quiet. She wanted a portrait put back. So the portrait was restored and the house was quiet. The Legend of Lady Skipworth. George Wythe House on the south side of Palace Green is a solid brick mansion that is one of the restored showpieces of colonial Williamsburg, built during the 18th century. There is nevertheless rather well-known ghost in residence, one who has been glimpsed and heard at various times over the 2 centuries. This would be Lady Anne Skipworth, the daughter of a Scottish merchant, born near Petersburg, 1741. She was described by those who knew her as an attractive yet temperamental young woman of disposition, something uncommon. More candidly interpreted, she had a fiery temper and preceded today's women's rights activists by more than 200 years by frequently speaking her mind. As one suitor wrote chauvinistically in his diary, she had haughtiness, I may even say a fierceness in her countenance, which on any little emotion destroyed in some degree the pretty softness which is so amiable in a young lady. She married Sir Peyton Skipworth, a wealthy planter, and settled down to a comfortable aristocratic life at Presswood in Mecklenburg County. Once in the waning days of Williamsburg glory in the 1770s, before the colonial capital was moved to Richmond in 1780. Sir Peyton and Lady Anne attended a gala at the governor's palace. She was resplendent in a creamy satin dress, high-heeled red slippers, which shone buckles of brilliance. But something happened at the ball. No one is quite sure just what, which triggered Lady Anne's famous temper. Offended by whatever slight it was, she bolted from the palace unescorted, even as the minuets continued, and dashed across the palace green to the Wythe House. Why she chose this site for her hasty departure remains unexplained, although she may have been a house guest. Whatever Lady Anne's storytellers agree that while en route, she broke either the strap or heel of one of her slippers and arrived at the house hobbling on one shoe, with the other foot clad only in a silk stocking. Thus she ascended the wooden stairs, sounding like a person with a peg leg. It is at this point where the accounts of the past writers and actual history part company. According to those who have chronicled the story, Lady Anne then in a fit of rage took her own life. The writers contend she was insanely jealous that Sir Peyton cared more for her sister Jean than for her, and what happened at the ball was the last straw. They also wrote that Lady Anne lived in Wythe House at the time. She is now buried in the small graveyard at nearby Burton Parish Church. Researchers at Colonial Williamsburg, however, say the facts are otherwise. Sir Peyton and Anne never lived in Wythe House. They never visited there. She did not commit suicide, rather she died in childbirth in 1779, and she is not buried at Burton Parish. Elizabeth Hill Skipworth, wife of Sir Peyton's brother, lies in rest there. What the researchers cannot refute, however, is that the Wythe House today is haunted for what with most commonly believed to be the spirit of Lady Anne. For nearly 200 years, a number of past residents, visitors, and Colonial Williamsburg employees have reported experiencing strikingly similar psychic phenomenon. Let's see what else is here. In all the annals of ghost stories recorded in the United States over the past 400 years, one of the most famous and one that most often been talked and written about is the notorious Bell Witch of Tennessee. Which sets this case apart is not so much the characteristics of the psychic manifestations involved, although they too were probably as intense and varied as many in memory, including rappings, howling, thrown objects, pinching, slapping, choking, blasphemous curses, and even poisonings. What is so different about the Bell Witch, separating it from most other lore and legend, is that this particular haunting was unquestionably the most thoroughly documented instance of violent psychic activity ever recorded at the time. Early in the 19th century, literally hundreds of people, including many experts, even the soon-to-be seventh President of the United States, Andrew Jackson, bore witness to the sheer havoc this she-devil wreaked over a sustained period of 4 years. It began in 1817, Robinson County, Tennessee, north of Nashville, on the farm of John Bell, who had 4 sons and a 12-year-old daughter named Betsy. One afternoon, John Bell saw perched on a split-rail fence a black bird of monstrous size. It was much larger than either a vulture or a turkey, and seemed to have an unnerving human gaze. As Bell stood transfixed, the great bird unfolded its wings and flapped across the field, casting a shadow over the skeletal corn stalks. The chilled his blood. It was as though he had glimpsed fleetingly the shadow of death. This was the harbinger of the witch's arrival. In time, the witch made herself and her purposes known. She said, Kate Batts, the woman who had sold the farm to the Bells. She claimed to have been cheated in the transaction and had returned from the dead to gain revenge. When she wasn't harassing Betsy, she turned her wrath on John Bell. He came afflicted with acute pains in his mouth. It was, he said, as if his tongue was growing stiff and swelling so much that he'd rather not eat nor talk for hours on end. Developed horrible facial contortions and uncontrollable tics. The witch cursed him incessantly, calling him vile names and predicting his imminent death. At the time, she continued to taunt Betsy, dragging her arms across the room by hair, and slapping her before dozens of terrified witnesses until her face turned scarlet red. When Andrew Jackson came with an entourage, including a psychic consultant, the witch went into a rage that drove the expert from the house. John Bell eventually went into siege of convulsions, and the witch somehow transformed a doctor's medicine into a murky toxic potion, which caused Bell to lapse into a coma. When he died, young Betsy's engagement to her childhood sweetheart was broken. 4 years after the witch had first appeared, the evil spell was apparently broken. What has this to do with the Virginia ghost? There is a striking similarity between the Bell Witch of Tennessee and the ghost doll Mammy Messick, who surfaced some years later in the town of Poquoson. It was almost as if Kate Batts had come back in a reincarnated spirit. The problem is some of the details have gotten mixed up in the retelling, principally whether what happened involved one or both of Dolly Mammy's teenagers. One respected area author says only one was victimized. Many say both. Angrily flinging on a cloak, Dolly turned to her daughters and told them that if anything happened to her, she would return to haunt them for the rest of their lives. With that, she disappeared into the gloom. When she did not come back by dark, a search party of friends and neighbors was hastily organized. They tramped through the marshes with lanterns calling her name, but they found nothing. The next morning, a fisherman easing his boat up Bell's Oyster Gut narrow estuary near the woman's home was startled by the sight of a bare leg sticking out of the marsh grasses. He went for help, and soon after the body of Dolly Mammy was recovered. She had apparently been stuck in a pocket of thick quicksand. It appeared that she had struggled desperately for her life because the rushes and grasses around her body had been pulled up. Her funeral was well attended. Not long after that, the haunting threat of Dolly Mammy began to be carried out. One day the girls went to visit relatives. No sooner had they arrived when ghostly knockings began to echo loudly throughout the house. Suspecting pranksters, a family member grabbed a piece of wood and barred the door. Incredibly, the bar leaped into the air from its iron fastenings and flew across the room. When the thunderous knockings, which seemed to follow the girls wherever they went, especially at their house, continued the main form of spectral manifestations, there were many other incidents as well. All sorts of things started to happen, says Ralph Rollins, a spectarian. I remember him telling me one night the two girls slept in a bed, and the next morning when they woke up, their hair was tightly braided together. No one could ever explain them. He told me many a time, being in the house, when a table in the middle of the room with a lamp on it would start shaking and jumping up and down. Then the lamp would go out and it would be dark, and he could hear the sounds of someone being slapped. He relit the lamp. The girls would have red marks on their faces with the handprint of a hand. He said that happened a number of times. See what happens there. Let's see. The celebrity spirits of Fort Monroe. Dennis, director of the Casemate Museum at the fort, offers a thought about why so many spirits seem to frequent the site. With the hundreds of thousands of people who have been assigned to the fort, there's a large population to draw for ghosts. There have been numerous sightings of strange apparitions, and many tend to repeat themselves and become identified in people's minds with the famous people who have been here. The history of the area dates back to the time of the first English settlement in America. The hardy souls aboard the Godspeed, Susan Constant, and Discovery saw Old Point Comfort, where Fort Monroe is located, in April 1607. At least 2 weeks before they anchored at Jamestown, a small exploration rowed ashore and met with the local Indians. In 1608, Captain John Smith checked the area out and deemed it an excellent site for a fort. Consequently, a year later, Captain John Ratcliffe was dispatched from Jamestown to build an earth fortification that was called Fort Algernon. By 1611, it was well stocked and had a battery of 7 heavy guns and a garrison of 40 men. A century later, there are 70 cannons at the fort, and in 1728, a new brick facility was constructed at Old Point Comfort and renamed Fort George. This structure was completely destroyed by hurricane in 1749. The strategic military value of the site was recognized by the French under Admiral Comte de Grasse during the Revolutionary War, when his men re-erected a battery here. The War of 1812 demonstrated the need for adequate American coastal defense, and over the next few years, plans were drawn up for an elaborate system of forts running from Maine to Louisiana. Old Point Comfort was elected as a key post in this chain, and the assignment for building a new fort there was given to Brigadier General Simon Bernard, a famous French military engineer. Upon its completion, the fort had an armament of 200 guns, which controlled the channel into Hampton Roads and dominated the approach to Washington by way of the Chesapeake Bay. So impregnable was the bastion and so ideally located, it was one of the few Union fortifications in the South that was not captured by the Confederates during the Civil War. It was described as unassailable base for the Union Army and Navy right in the heart of the Confederacy. It was also at Fort Monroe a year later that the imprisonment of Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America, led many to believe to one of the first and most famous ghost stories associated with the site. Davis, who had been planning to establish the capital Confederacy in Texas with the hopes of continuing the war, was captured near Irwinville, Georgia, on May 10, 1865. His devoted wife, Varna, rushed forward when it appeared that a Northern cavalryman was about to shoot her defiant husband, and has also been accused inaccurately of plotting an attempt to assassinate Lincoln. Davis was taken to Fort Monroe, then the most powerful fort in the country, to prevent escape or rescue attempts. On May 23, 1865, he was placed in solitary confinement in a cell in casemate number 2, a stone-walled chamber, creating a painful incident which almost cost him his life, and may have well provided the cause for the periodic spectral return of Varna Davis to Fort Monroe during the past century. A day after his imprisonment, Davis was ordered to be shackled. When a blacksmith knelt down the ankle irons in place, the angered Davis knocked him to the floor. He sprang to his feet, raised his hammer, and was about to crush the Southerner's skull, when the officer of the day, Captain Jerome Tiltmore, threw himself between the two men. Thereafter, it took 4 Union soldiers to subdue Davis long enough for the irons to be secured. The next day, Dr. John J. Craven, Chief Medical Officer of Fort Monroe, examined the prisoner and was shocked at his sickly appearance. He quickly recommended the shackles be removed, and they were days later. Meanwhile, the determined Varna fought hard for her more humane treatment of her husband, and eventually she and Dr. Craven were successful. Davis was removed to better quarters in Carroll Hall. In May 1866, Varna got permission from the President Andrew Jackson to join Davis at the fort, and she brought along their young daughter Winnie. Jefferson was released from captivity on May 13, 1867, traveled extensively in Europe, and later retired to Beauvoir, a mansion in Mississippi, where he died in 1889 at the age of 81. It is supposed the apparition of the iron-willed Varna, who has been seen on occasion at the fort, appearing late at night through the second-floor window of quarters directly from the casemate where her husband had been so harshly shackled. A number of residents have reported seeing her. One awoke early one morning, a glimpse the figures of both a plumpish woman and a young girl peering through the window. She got out of bed and walked toward them. When she reached out to touch the woman's billowing skirt, the figures disappeared. A wide range of psychic phenomenon has been experienced in a splendid old plantation-style house facing the Sally Port that is known as Old Quarters Number 1. Manifestations have included the clumping of boots, the rustling of silken skirts, the sounds of distant laughter, and shredding of fresh flower petals in midwinter. It is here, appropriately enough, in the Lincoln Room, where the image of Honest Abe himself has been clad in a dressing gown, standing by the fireplace appearing to be deep in thought, according to Jane Kane Polisky and Joan McFarland Drum, who in 1972 published a book on the ghost of Fort Monroe. Other residents of the house have been told to see Lafayette Grant and Chief Blackcourt wandering. All of them stayed at the old Ghost Quarters number 1 during their lifetimes. What are you playing with? I don't see anything. Undoubtedly the most famous enlisted man ever to serve at Fort Monroe, even if only for 4 months, was a 19-year-old named Edgar Allan Poe. He arrived at Old Point Comfort on December 15, 1828, and almost immediately sought help to get out of the army so he could pursue a career in writing. He was successful in discharge at Fort Monroe on April 15, 1829. These are some interesting stories. What do you think? Are you still here? Uh, what do you think? I think I should do another video for the other ones. So stay tuned after this for the other. Might as well do 2 if thens. This is like if then 85 or 6 or something. This is what my if then is for this day. And I hope you enjoyed the ghost. I gotta catch my friend here. Have a good one.